this class focuses specifically on writing analytically, and in order to write well analytically, you need to develop analytical reading skills. Those two things are very much tied together. So, we're going to discuss some strategies for becoming a more active reader as opposed to a passive reader. And those strategies apply both for the reading of fiction and nonfiction texts. Okay, so the first thing that we want to talk about is the fact that we can actually read on three different levels. And the first of those levels is the literal level. This means reading the lines. In other words, you're just reading the words that are on the page and trying to understand what the author is communicating there. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but reading on the literal level can actually be quite difficult when you're presented with complex texts, which is usually the case in academics, right? So, for example, if you are studying for a pathophysiology exam and you're reading several chapters of your textbook, that's very information dense. It's packed with a lot of material. And so that in and of itself presents a difficulty. But you're not just trying to remember words or information, you're trying to understand it well enough to be able to respond to exam questions successfully. And you need to understand one concept well before you can move on to the other most of the time, because usually things build on each other. That's for, a regular science class, but you might also have trouble reading on the literal level if the ideas in the text are rather complex. So, for example, if you're reading like a philosophical essay, even if you're reading an academic article that you intend to use potentially in a research paper for one of your classes, you are, let's say, reading a study, and this study is 20 pages long, and it has many variables, and there are a lot of factors that go into play, and it's divided into several subsections, and the language is very academic, and it's full of particular jargon, and so all of those things make it difficult just to understand the text on a literal level. And so that alone takes work when you're reading academically. But we don't want to read only on the literal level. We also want to be able to read on the inferential level. We also call this the interpretive level. So it's when you're interpreting a text. And what we mean by that is that you're reading not just the lines, but you're reading between the lines. In other words, you're reading into something. You're not just reading the text, you are reading the subtext. So what is being suggested, not necessarily only what's being said overtly. So that's the inferential level. And then we can also read on the evaluative level. So when we're reading on the evaluative level, we're reading beyond the lines. In other words, perhaps you were looking at a particular passage of a text and you were really reading into that, and you can write a whole paragraph just in that passage because you have a lot to say about it that wasn't necessarily obviously there. But now you're trying to consider how that passage connects or relates with the text as a whole. So how it fits in with the big picture. You can even go outside the bounds of the text itself. You can ask yourself, well, how does this passage, the ideas in this passage, work in society at large? Or you can connect it to previous knowledge. So perhaps last week you sat in a lesson in your class, and now you're reading something a week later, and you recognize certain ideas that overlap there, or certain connections, and so you try to make those connections in your mind. When you're doing all three of these things, you're reading on three levels, you are developing a much more in-depth understanding of the text than if you're just reading on the literal level. Now, I suppose that you could read something and say to yourself, I'm going to read this just on the literal level, and then I'm going to read it again on the inferential level, and then I'm going to read it again on the evaluative level. But realistically, that's just not how people read. So very practiced readers are usually engaging in all three levels kind of simultaneously. And the reason for that is that active readers engage in a conversation or a dialogue with the text. So that means you're not just letting the text happen to you, you are an active participant in the text. You're asking questions of yourself, you're making connections, you're asking questions of the author. So remember, the text does not exist for itself, the text exists for the reader. And so it should be a back and forth kind of communication, a relationship between the text and the